Welcome to the One Person Business Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Carly Reese.
And I'm Joe Rando.
And Joe, we had an episode recently that was kind of similar to the topic that we're going to talk about today, but we want to be focusing on mental health for our audience and for solopreneurs, because I think that's something that people struggle with a lot when they're working alone, whether it's the solitude or just that they don't know where to find answers. And so we really want to be shedding light on this as much as possible. And so this is not a repeat episode of a similar one that we had with Renee Latour that was published a few weeks ago. We're going to go much more in depth, and we actually have an actual psychotherapist on today. So Leah, I'm so excited that you're here. Leah Marone is a psychotherapist with over 20 years of experience based in Charlotte, North Carolina. She has facilitated over 20,000 therapy sessions. Can't even do the math on that, how many that is like a week. She writes for Psychology Today and is an expert forum contributor for Newsweek, that tiny publication that you may have heard of. Leah was a former anxiety-ridden Division I basketball player, which has led to her passion for working with athletes and coaches on combating pressure, imposter syndrome, which I've definitely fallen victim to, perfectionism, and performance anxiety. As a mental wellness consultant, Leah works with companies and nonprofits on topics such as anxiety and stress, burnout, compassion, fatigue, productivity, effective communication, and emotional intelligence. We want to dabble in a few of these things today. So Leah, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And yes, I'm very excited about just the topic and who I'm speaking to. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, something we hear time and time again, and I think I may have asked this to somebody in the past, but I like hearing people's different responses, is so many times you'll hear solopreneurs say, oh, I'm so stressed, or, oh, I'm so anxious right now. And they kind of use those terms interchangeably. Is there a difference?
Yes, that's a great question. And the skinny of it is that stress is triggered by external stimulus, right? And it's typically there's an ending. So if you think about it as, well, my in-laws are coming to town, or I have a big call tomorrow, or I have this deadline for this project. And that's not to say that there can be several at a time that are triggering us, right? But it's typically an identifiable external thing. And if we are not mindful of kind of, managing our stress, which we're going to have peaks of stress, like that's just natural. That's part of being human and searching for like progression and delving into new things. That's normal. But if you're in this perpetual state of stress and you're not doing a great job of letting air out of your balloon, if you will, then that's when, if whether you're highly prone or not to anxiety, that's the internal triggers, the internal things that we then, the false narratives. It's the living futuristically. It's living in the past. Anxiety is anything but living in the here and now. It's anticipating. And a lot of times, unfortunately, those have negative tints to them, right? Where we're thinking of the worst case scenarios. And so a lot of times you'll see typically people that struggle with a lot of anxiety, they tend to sometimes externally look very calm and cool. And inside they're going a million miles an hour, right? And so they've kind of gotten used to, well, this is kind of how I operate. And it's this internal drive. It's this lens that we're seeing things through. So again, the distinction is stress is external triggers, and, anxiety is those internal triggers, kind of our narratives, how we, process things. So they're different. They have similar symptoms though, but they're different with how they arrive.
It sounds to me like stress is easier to manage, or then because it's got something out in the world that you can address. Is that true, or are they equally difficult, or it depends?
It really, it kind of depends on the scenario. I think sometimes those narratives or those thought patterns and anxious cycles, as we call them, those can be incredibly strenuous and exhausting. Not that stress isn't, but those can be exhausting, because a lot of times when we are presented with a stressor, anxiety just accompanies it, right? It's like we are looking at something and we're like, oh my gosh, I'm so frazzled. I have this, all these things on my to-do list. But then we move in maybe to that negative self-talk of, why do I always feel like this? What's wrong with me? Why can't I get this together? Why do I do this? Other people probably think this. And that's more of that self-talk. That's more of that internal. So they can go simultaneously. But that's why when we look at stress management and why it's so important, it's really kind of soothing and almost like anticipating or combating that internal inner relationship we have with ourselves and diffusing sometimes that inner critic and just that the negative self-talk that really fuels that anxiety.
Well, so, I mean, for solopreneurs, it's, can I provide for my family this week? Like, am I good enough to fly solo? That imposter syndrome we were talking about, there are just so many things that could enter your head at any given moment. So you were talking about stress management. How can people control or better or manage their anxiety, and how can they prevent it? And then how can they bounce back? Because you also said it's exhausting, and solopreneurs can't afford to be exhausted. They have an entire business to run. So what would your tips be for that?
Yeah, and many solopreneurs and, just people in general, unfortunately, these days, almost think it's weird or uncomfortable if they're not stressed or not going a million miles an hour. It's very interesting. It's like, oh, I just need a break. Oh, I need some time away. Oh, I need this. But then when they might be able to block that out or have that, they can't be present with it, right? It's so interesting. So if you think about, too, that perpetual, like, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this, we've kind of conditioned ourselves to be in this constant state of urgency. And when we're not there, it's very interesting. I hear from so many people, and I know this has happened to me. Once you go on that vacation, once you have that day off and you're like, wow, I'm out of my rhythm. I really need to like break free and have some time to rejuvenate and relax. Guess what? All those like suppression bubbles, all those things that you've like pushed down and almost suppressed because you're in this constant state of urgency with to-do items and things to do and these deeper worries, you're pushing all these other things down. You're not being mindful of clearing that clutter on your own. So when we have that pocket, whether we're sleeping, whether we're going on vacation, that's when the body and the mind recognize, here's some space. We got to clear this clutter. And all that stuff starts coming up. And it's terrible because a lot of people go on vacation and they're like, I was an anxious mess. And I was away from my work, or I was away from this. It was still there, but all these other things started coming up. And that's a great indicator that you are not maintaining or, in the maintenance process of clearing your own clutter, of just having any type of presence work, of any type of just connection and self-connection work, and the body and the mind take over. That's what panic attacks are, essentially.
It's so funny you said that. I was thinking a week after I got engaged years ago, and my husband and I decided to go on vacation like 2 weeks after. We were gone for a week, and day 2, I was like, we need to do this. My mind was just racing. We have to get this done. We have to get this done. And he was like, whoa, the person I proposed to a week ago was not a bridezilla. And now you're totally turning into one. And it was because I just took a step out of the day-to-day. And it was like, my mind was like, there's so much we need to do.
Yes.
So that was my maybe a trivial thing. But I can totally see how winding down can kind of just release everything.
Right. And we get emotional hangovers. A lot of times it's like we'll get through a really rigorous stretch of something or week or something has ended. And a lot of times you'll find that you were able to keep it together. You were kind of in that, fight or flight mode. And then all of a sudden, after you're done and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that's over. I can relax. There's this sense of relief. A lot of times, again, just because you were in that state of action, sometimes those things that you had to suppress in order to survive and to execute, they resurface.
I love this because I think so many people feel like when they do go on that vacation or take that break and then all of a sudden all this stuff comes up, feel like something's really wrong with me. Like something's really wrong that I can't take a vacation. And it's like, if you don't have yet knowing why, now you can at least say, no, it's not something wrong with me. It's something wrong maybe with the way I'm operating my business and my life. But that's really, really helpful to have that perspective to understand why that kind of thing is happening. Thank you.
And I want to circle back to something else we're talking about, and something that was in your intro too, was the imposter syndrome. And I feel like solopreneurs fall victim to that time and time again. I mentioned that I have, how do you get rid of that little guy that's telling you you can't do it and that's telling you you're in the wrong space, go back to your corporate job?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing to really highlight is just from experience too, and I know I've suffered from it myself, but it's interesting because I think a lot of people that, suffer from imposter syndrome or just like symptoms, or not even symptoms, but traits of it, is they're go-getters typically, right? They're in the eyes of other people, they're successful. And they take risks and they're willing to put themselves out there. And so it's this like, already they're at this level of like success that other, but they still suffer from, gosh, I'm just not good enough. And in some ways that has propelled them to keep taking those risks, to keep fighting. And it's, serve them justice and to stay motivated and kind of structured. But like anything, it can get to be too much. And that's when that negative self comes in. That's when those false narratives kind of come in and almost self-sabotage. But it's interesting to think about that voice of you're not good enough, or, you entered this space and probably everyone in this space probably thinks, why are they here? Why is she here? Why is he here? That notion. That's your ego talking. But it's also, if you identify it as like your protector, we have several protectors that we have gathered over the years, probably since we were, little kids for various reasons. And that protector does not want you to fail. That protector wants to prevent you from embarrassment or shame or walking away like, oh, that was terrible. And if you really fact check yourself and pull from the data that you've had, your data, that's probably not happened very much, given that most people that suffer from that are willing to take risks and logically can say, I know that this is a process. I know it's not black and white, but when we fall into that black and white, all or nothing thinking, our protector is ignited, right? Our protector, the one saying, well, you don't want to look like an idiot, or you're not good enough, or you don't have your degree from there, or you didn't do this, or you didn't talk to this person. That is your protector coming in way too fierce. And I think rather than trying to combat it and shut it down, we have to work how to collaborate with it. We have to acknowledge that that part of me is actually trying to protect me. That part of me, though, is not trusting the other parts of me that are really motivated, that are highly successful, that take risks, that, have done X, Y, and Z. So I think where we misstep that is we judge, what's wrong with me? Why am I not confident? Everyone else is confident. At this point in my career, I should be confident. Rather than judging, rather than trying to combat, it's aligning with that protector. It's aligning with that imposter and trying to soothe it and trying to almost have it gain trust in us. And that's just a really great reframe in general. When you have those inhibitions or like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing this, or what's wrong with you? Those are your protective layers and they're there for a reason. You don't want them to go away. You just need to work with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, silencing or working with that is such a great point. And I feel like if people can get that more under control, it'll help with the other pressure that they have with running a business, because solopreneurs just have so much on their shoulders. And so just to get that out of their system, it will be super helpful. But what about running the rest of the business? How can solopreneurs alleviate that pressure of just handling everything from marketing to operations to responding to client customer emails? Like that, there's just a lot. Do you have any tips for just letting them like take it one step at a time?
Well, and you said it, it's kind of that one step at a time, but that's so hard. And, I think all of us, probably everyone even listening, would give someone else the best advice when it's like, oh, well, you have to take things one step at a time, and you really have to be patient with yourself. And you have to acknowledge that when you took this leap of faith, you knew it was going to be overwhelming. We all know how to spit that game, but it's applying it, right? And I think, again, the biggest thing involved in it is just really being aware of how we're talking to ourselves. And that fierce competitor, that fierce inner critic that we have that's driving almost like be productive, be productive, be productive. We have to acknowledge that's a great part of us. But I think it also a lot of times leads us into that multitasking. It leads us into that frenzy. And most solopreneurs that I meet with, entrepreneurs, they have not, some of them that are just highly stressed all the time, they have not found the art of let me, for just the majority of time, refrain from multitasking. Let me try to focus on one task. I know that's not reality all the time, but one task at a time, and really try to diffuse and silence other things that could distract me, especially that voice inside saying, you're not being productive enough. This isn't really worth your time. Let's do something else. And they're just jumping from one thing to another. There's the frenzy, the urgency. And so once you start to diffuse that, once you know that like, this is your clock and that you are a go-getter, you are able to do this, things start to shift a little bit. But it's that multitasking. People are even doing it with their self-care. I mean, it's amazing how many people I talk to and they're like, oh yeah, I like to watch Netflix, but I also like to play Candy Crush, and I also like to have a snack, and I also like to talk to somebody at the same time. And it's like, all these things are canceling each other out. It's like running on a treadmill and eating chocolate cake. It's like, which one are you trying to do?
So
that doesn't sound too bad, though.
You're saying meditating while I'm riding my bike is a bad idea? Is that what you're saying?
That's okay. I would be cautious,
okay?
But like, I think meditating, it depends on how you're meditating. If you're meditating full blown, wanting to like
with your eyes shut,
that's different. But there's that presence meditation that, is a difference.
But, this is just like drives home the point so much is like, we just have so much stuff coming at us. I mean, the Slack and the email and the text messages and then you start thinking about the brain going on and saying, I should do this, I got to do that, I got to do that, I got to do that. And it's nuts. It's nuts. I mean, I've been working and I haven't worked hard enough yet at cutting down that noise and trying to do more because I was a notorious multitasker and it was not good. So, but it's hard.
One other question, because some people say they thrive off of stress and that they get their best work done when they're constantly busy, constantly emotion, constantly have pressure on themselves. What do you say to those people?
So those people, and again, we're stereotyping here, but I think a lot of times those people also are really good at recovery. So they have like pockets of time, or they're like, I work my ass off during the day and I do this and I get it all done and I'm efficient. But those people also know and are stellar at recovery. That's what I found.
Wow.
And so when you are great at recovery, you got it. And I think for me, like, you think about even just being an athlete or, being, knee deep into something like I am, all in or not even knee deep, though all the way in. You work really hard. You are focused. You got it. But once that game's over, once that's over or whatever you know how to recover. You know how to recover, you know how to validate yourself, and you have those pockets of that so that you can, you're not as like, basically, you're not a victim of kind of that just up and flow burnout pattern and crashing and burning. So I think that's the distinction, because I know people that are just like, man, they're just churning it out. But those are the people too that when they are recovering, when they are relaxing, when they are nurturing other parts of who they are, they're all in with that too. And that's pretty amazing.
Well, I'm so glad you said nurturing who they are, because as a solopreneur, you're working with yourself. You might work with contractors, but a relationship that people often neglect to focus on is the relationship with themselves. So do you have any, I know you were just talking about some of the pointers for the people that have the quick recovery, but for people that don't have a quick recovery, what can they do to foster that relationship?
Sure. And it is. And a lot of times, when I get in front of people, they've already crashed and burned. And it's like, okay, now what do I do? And I think it's a lot of times it's, we can Google self-care stuff all day if we want. And we can even, probably spit some out. But self-care, again, it's more in depth than that. It is fostering and nurturing that relationships with ourselves. And I think there's so many transitions throughout the day that we don't take advantage of. If the common answer is like, well, you need to do this and you need to do this. Well, I don't have time. You might not. But if you think about the transitions that you have, whether it's brushing your teeth or changing your clothes or getting in your car and physically going somewhere different, those are mini pockets, several pockets throughout the day for you to even have a few seconds of a reset. And what I mean by that is just, you got to train yourself. You got to get in the habit. But just even that quick, breath, even that quick, let me just look around and see what my current environment has to offer. Thinking about you at a red light. Most of us at a red light, we're so quick to pulling out our phone. Did someone text me? Is there any updates? Do I have an email? Rather than just taking those moments at a red light, whether it's 5 seconds or the whole minute or what have you, that you just revert back to your 5 senses and think, what do I see? What do I hear? I may have been at this intersection hundreds of times, but there's always something different to pick up on. Those mini bursts of presence in any form is almost like if you have a whiteboard and you wipe it clean. Now, don't get me wrong, stuff might be filling right back up, but you get that cleanse. You get that really quick cleanse and you have an opportunity to check in. How am I doing? Where am I at? What do I see? And we don't do that enough. Again, we're conditioning ourselves to be so incredibly highly stimulated, so incredibly just nonstop, because if we're not, then we're not being productive. We're not being effective. We don't want this. We don't want this enough. And that we got to change. We got to reframe that. I think a really great almost like framework that you could use too. And some of you may have this, but having those bookends, thinking of your day as a bookend, and whether you have 50 roles, other than just, and you will if you're a solopreneur, entrepreneur, but like you have more roles than that, I'm guessing, not just professionally. And so thinking though about what you can have that's sacred and just yours in the morning, and it can look different day to day, and something in the evening that you're incredibly deliberate with, that acknowledges like the middle might be chaos, might be pretty unpredictable, might not be a whole lot that you can control, but I'm going to have these two things that are mine. And that could be, going to the gym, that could be listening to something, that could be going for a walk, or even just, whatever it is. That could be having your cup of coffee in silence and not checking your email and eating breakfast at the same time. Like having these pockets of just presence, opportunity to sit with you is, it's just something that we need to get better at, and having that cleanse. Because otherwise our balloon is just constantly filling up and we're not doing a good job of letting air out, and then we pop. And then we got to rebuild and we got to gear ourselves up. And the same cycle just keeps going and going and going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And reminding ourselves it's okay to be bored too. I mean, that you were saying that with a lot of that, but
it's
what? Funny, bored.
I'm kidding. It's like nobody's bored anymore. Nobody's ever bored.
My 5-year-old the other day was like, "Oh, mommy, I'm bored." And I was like, okay, one, we've been home for 2 minutes. But I was like, honey, cool, that's so awesome. And she was like, why is that so awesome? And I go, because now you can go be creative and you can let your imagination run. I was like, I'm so excited for you that you're bored. And she was kind of like, what are you talking about? And as I was saying it, I was like, I say this to a 5-year-old, but why don't I say this to my friends? And why don't I say this to adults? We just forgot what that feels like in the tech era.
We're so out of shape. I like to use that a lot.
Yeah,
out of shape.
Out of shape is a great way to, because it's like, I used to sit there and nothing going on and think of some interesting idea. And now, scroll, just pull up my smartphone and see what's going on in, the New York Times or whatever. And it's next phase is to knock that off for sure.
Yeah. So I would, I think, a lot of people say like, what's your main advice, or, what's the one piece of advice? And it's just like, it doesn't have to be hours upon hours because we don't have that, but using what you have, using those transitions and really being real with what you typically do in those, even as you're taking a shower, are you constantly just running through your to-do list? Is that helpful? Great. If not, like think of just these pockets when you're brushing your teeth, when you're, all these things. When are you multitasking and when don't you need to? When can you just be? Because again, stress and anxiety is so future-based and past-based, and we're missing that presence. And that's what really helps balance us out.
Well, it's funny because we think that if we take the time to do all of this, we're just going to get stressed out, when the reality is this prevents the burnout.
And that's
everything you're just saying.
That's a really hard that's really hard to shift, that shift. And I get it. It's like, well, if I don't do this and I don't do this, then, I'm going to miss out, or I'm not working hard enough, and then I'm not going to be able to relax, and then I'm not going to achieve my goals. Again, there's that fear. And that too, I think you label that as that's your protector, and your protector is coming in way too hot, and you need to soothe it. You need to channel some of that resilience and some of that confidence that if you don't check that email or send that email at 1 a.m., nobody's going to die. It's going to be okay. And if you know too that you're probably going to be firing on all cylinders if you try to get some more sleep versus being up with that urgency. Because guess what? The next day you're going to find other things that are going to create that urgency. It's not like the next day you're going to be lounging by the pool, right?
Mm-hmm. It's so funny. One of my close friends is a neurosurgeon. And I'm like, okay, if she doesn't respond to her text, that's one thing. If I don't respond to a text, an email might go out 10 minutes late. Like, who cares?
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It's just kind of like putting in perspective what you're really, and I'm not trying to diminish what we're doing. We love helping solopreneurs, but things can wait. They aren't as urgent as we think they are. Yeah. Well, it's funny. So something I wanted to ask you, because I think you talked about this previously throughout your content. And Joe and I, we don't give advice from like you should do this, because we're just here to help. Who are we to say that we are the experts on experts? But I think you said at one point that advice can fuel burnout. And we're talking about burnout So I was like, oh my gosh, am I fueling my own burnout? Is that true or is that not true? Giving advice.
Yeah. So yes, I think, and a lot of times the advice I'm talking about isn't that, or it's, if someone comes to you and it's a pretty clear cut, concrete issue, like, oh yes, this is how you do this. Or this is how this is the tool that you would use to make this spreadsheet. Those are concrete, that's fine. You're walking through something that's not emotional in nature. Once you start, if you kind of evaluate your relationships, whether it's people that you collaborate with, whether it's your children, whether it's your partner, your friends, just taking a moment and noticing as you're in conversations with people or just in general, are you really quick, especially when there's emotion involved or some sort of issue, are you incredibly quick to just giving advice? Are you quick to take that false ownership of what really should lay with that person? And what I mean by that is a lot of times, they're so quick to relate it back to them. They're so quick to give advice. And rather than being kind of that space creator for other people, it's like they have stock or ownership in all these other things, all these other issues that are, not necessarily theirs. And when I'm saying this, I'm not saying like you should just be you and not help anybody and not lead with empathy. I'm not saying that. But I think what we're doing is, again, we lack patience, especially even in our interactions with the people that we love most. We're not coming with curiosity. We're coming with like, oh, you should do this. And not to say our advice isn't good, but as well as I do, people don't do it. They got to have their own flavor to it. We have to meet them where they're at. And I think it can create that burnout or compassion fatigue, as I like to call it, because we're not executing these conversations correctly. Like if you think, for example, my job, as a psychotherapist, as a clinician, a lot of people will say, how do you do it? How do you give advice all day? And I say, well, I'm really not. Because if I did, and I was like, well, this is exactly what you should do, or you need to break up with him, or this is what, giving this really concrete advice for these incredibly complex emotional situations, I would not sleep. I would be totally overinvested in all of my patients' lives, my friends' lives, my family's lives. And not to say that I never slip up, and I'm not, but man, it's almost like I also would be creating this codependency of like, oh, Leah's going to fix this, or Leah will structure this, or Leah's really got ownership of this. So I'll just circle back to her. That creates that burnout. So being really aware of how we enter conversations, the role that we, acquire, the space that we create. And I like to say too, and this is the title of my book coming out, is supporting rather than solving. So support, don't solve, right? And that gives people the reps they need to problem solve, to gain that confidence and resilience. And it limits us from taking that false ownership and having this false sense of stock in all these things, which really creates that burnout and can be incredibly exhausting. It doesn't need to be.
I think that's just so important for solopreneurs to keep in mind too, when they're trying to help their customers, trying to help their clients. They just to keep that in mind. And that's why I wanted to ask you this question, because I think a lot of them, myself included, are so quick to be like, this is what I know. This is what I know. And it's like that might be to their detriment.
And I think an important point you made is that you can get invested in this, hand out this advice, and people won't do it. And I mean, even in management, the accepted wisdom is don't tell people what to do, particularly if it's something important that they're going to be doing a lot of work on, is get them to figure out what to do. And hopefully it kind of aligns with your vision, but not just sitting there going, okay, now I want you to do this, because guess what? They're not going to have buy-in. And then if it doesn't work, it's like, sorry, here you go. And so that makes a lot of sense to approach it that way.
Yeah,
Easy on the advice.
Allowing people to get those reps in, right? And I think as well, you're right. I think even just asking people, well, let's look at this. Like, tell me what your options might be. Tell me what your next steps might be. It's asking those right questions and coming from that curiosity. So people, again, go through that process and that problem solving skills that a lot of us lack.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, Leah, this has just been so wonderful. I feel like this topic is just so helpful for solopreneurs. And Joe, like we were saying, like we just want to shed light on this because it often doesn't go discussed. And as a solopreneur, you kind of want to hold your head high and be like, oh, I've got all this covered to validate flying solo. And they don't need to, and they're not alone. So we just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention and everybody listening. Leah, this has been so wonderful. We are curious. We ask every guest this question. What is your favorite quote about success?
Ooh, well, I think it stems from my childhood and my basketball days, but you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Spoken like a true basketball player.
Yes.
I love it.
Yeah, that's just resonated with me as an athlete, and I think just as a person. So I think from a little girl, I was always thankfully encouraged to just take risks, go out there. What's the worst that can happen? And I think that's really helps. And I mean, it does. It builds that confidence, and you get your reps in for sure.
Oh, well, that's great. I love the quote. And where can people find you if they want to learn more about you or reach out to you?
Yeah. So my website is leahmarone.com, and there's a lot more info in there. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. My email is just leah@leahmarone.com, and happy to help, whether it's helping you set boundaries or even, if you do have a team or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, I feel like it's an isolating thing, but it doesn't have to be. So even though you're doing everything alone, it's interesting to kind of springboard or kind of make sure you have those people in your world that you can kind of be candid with and authentic with. And I think that's incredibly important.
It's funny because when we cut to the outro of this podcast, the first line people are going to hear is flying solo in business doesn't mean you're alone. So glad you just said that. Yeah. So thanks for taking that up. And we just really, really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
And listeners, we hope you enjoyed it as much as we do. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the One Person Business Podcast next week. Have a great week.